Millionaire finds a homeless mother and child in his mansion. What happened next shocked everyone. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. His mansion was meant to be silent, but that night it wasn't. A child's cry cut through the storm, sharp and desperate, echoing off the marble walls like an accusation. Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire who had built his life on control and suspicion, followed the sound and opened a door he never expected. Inside, a young mother clutched her trembling daughter, both soaked and shivering, eyes filled with fear. In that moment, wealth and loneliness collided with poverty and desperation, and the line between intruder and victim blurred. He had the power to throw them out. He also had the choice to let them stay. What would you have done in his place? Daniel Whitmore was a billionaire who lived alone in a mansion too big for one man. Success had given him everything except warmth. Behind the polished walls, silence was his only company, and he had grown used to it. That night, as he stepped inside, the silence was broken by a sound that stopped him cold. A child's cry. Thin, desperate, piercing. It rattled something deep inside him that money had never touched. He followed the sound, each step heavier than the last, until he pushed open the storage room door. What he saw pulled at him in ways he didn't want to admit. A young woman sat hunched on the floor, clutching a small child to her chest. The little girl trembled violently, her lips pale, her tiny fists clinging to her mother's coat. The woman's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide, not with defiance but with raw fear. Daniel's instinct was fury. His voice rose, harsh and accusing, demanding an explanation. To him, they were trespassers, maybe thieves. He had built his life on suspicion, on guarding what was his, and his pride would not bend. Yet his gaze returned to the child, shivering, fragile, helpless, and something broke inside him. It was a crack he despised, because it felt too close to his own forgotten wounds. Sarah held her daughter tighter, her voice trembling as she spoke. She whispered about rain, fear, and having nowhere else to go. The words came out fractured, soaked in humiliation, but Daniel heard them. They carried no trick, no scheme. They were the last breath of someone cornered by life, begging only for safety. In that cramped room, 3 lives collided. A man hardened by solitude, a mother stripped of everything but her will to protect, and a child too young to understand. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pulled in 2 directions. Pride demanded he throw them out, but something softer whispered that this night was different. He hated that he could feel the walls around him start to crumble. Daniel's voice was sharp as a blade when he demanded an answer, but Sarah did not flinch. Her arms wrapped tighter around Emma, and her words tumbled out in fragments. She said she had not meant to break in, that the rain had been brutal, that her little girl had started burning with fever, and she had nowhere else to turn. Her voice cracked with every sentence, more like a confession than an excuse. Daniel narrowed his eyes, refusing to let sympathy soften him. He had spent years training himself to see through weakness, to treat every plea as a tactic. Still, the child's shallow breathing pulled at him. Emma whimpered against her mother's chest, her tiny body trembling, her lips taking on a bluish shade that no performance could fake. Daniel's mind raced. He could call security and have them thrown out. He could let the police handle it and erase the problem in minutes. That was the logical choice, the safe choice. He told himself this was the only way to protect what he had built. But his chest tightened as his eyes lingered on the child. Sarah whispered again, her words nearly breaking. She said she did not want charity. She only wanted her daughter to live through the night. Daniel's jaw clenched as he listened, hating the way her desperation pressed against his guarded heart. He told himself she was manipulating him, but a deeper voice asked why a woman would risk humiliation if she had another option. The silence between them grew heavier, broken only by Emma's weak cough. He crouched closer, almost against his will, and studied the little girl's face. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, glazed with fever, and in that fragile gaze, Daniel saw something that jolted him. It was the same look his younger sister had given him decades ago, when she had lain sick in a small apartment they could not afford to heat. She had not survived that winter. The memory hit him like a blow, tearing open wounds he thought he had buried beneath wealth and time. His throat felt dry. Logic screamed that he was being reckless, that strangers did not belong in his world. Yet his heart refused to turn away. Emma's fragile hand twitched, as if reaching for something she would never find. Daniel exhaled a long, uneven breath, realizing he was no longer deciding between right and wrong. He was deciding between closing the door on the past or letting it change him. For the first time in years, he let his pride fall silent. He told Sarah to stay quiet and to sit the child down so he could see her better. His voice was still rough, but softer at the edges. Sarah obeyed with trembling hands, lowering Emma onto a folded blanket. Daniel touched the girl's forehead, and the heat of her fever startled him. It was real, it was urgent, and suddenly, the question was no longer whether he should let them stay. It was whether he could live with himself if he turned them away. Daniel's decision came with reluctance, but once spoken, he did not take it back. He told Sarah she could stay in the living room for the night. The words sounded harsh, even to his own ears, yet he felt a strange relief when she whispered her thanks and lowered her daughter onto the couch. For the first time, his home was not empty, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Sarah moved slowly, as if afraid to disturb the space she did not belong to. She opened the refrigerator with hesitation, her hands trembling while she searched for something to feed her child. She found eggs, bread, and a few vegetables, ordinary things that had no meaning to him, but looked like treasures in her hands. Daniel watched as she fumbled to prepare a simple meal, her exhaustion visible, yet her care for Emma steady and unwavering. Emma stirred awake, her eyes lighting up at the smell of warm food. She laughed softly, a fragile but pure sound, when her mother offered her a small bite. It was nothing fancy, only scrambled eggs and toast, but to the little girl, it was a feast. Daniel felt something inside shift as he watched her chew happily, her cheeks round and flushed with new energy. Sarah smiled faintly, feeding her daughter with patience that carried more love than any luxury ever could. Daniel stood in the doorway, unable to move. The scene felt foreign in his mansion, a place built for status but stripped of life. For years, he had walked through silent rooms, yet here, with a tired woman and her sick child, warmth bloomed in corners he had forgotten. The meal ended quickly, but its impact lingered. Emma curled against her mother, giggling as if the night's hunger had never happened. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, her face soft for the first time that evening. Daniel looked on, unsettled by how something so ordinary could feel extraordinary. In their small moment of peace, he realized that no amount of wealth had ever given him the comfort he was witnessing now. That night, as Emma's breathing grew steady against her chest, Sarah lay awake, with her eyes open in the dark. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heater, but her mind drifted far from its warmth. Memories came uninvited, rushing in like a tide she could not hold back. She saw herself years ago, a young woman in a white coat, walking through hospital corridors with books pressed to her chest. Professors praised her for her discipline. Friends admired her for her kindness. She had carried dreams larger than her body, certain she would one day change lives. Then came the phone call. The voice on the other end was flat, almost mechanical, as it told her about the accident. Her parents were gone, taken in a moment by twisted metal and broken glass. The world she had known collapsed in seconds, and with it went the fragile safety net that had carried her this far. She remembered sitting alone in her dorm, clutching her knees, unable to process how one night could erase everything. The bills arrived quickly, stacking higher than her hope. She tried to juggle classes and shifts at a diner, but exhaustion gnawed at her until her grades began to slip. Still, she fought, whispering to herself that her parents had not sacrificed everything for her to quit. But grief weighed heavy, and the emptiness at home left scars no lecture could heal. She held on, even when holding on meant barely standing. It was during that fragile time she met Christopher. He was charming in the way broken hearts are vulnerable to. He spoke with ease, listened with intensity, and promised her a future that sounded like salvation. She let him in, slowly at first, then all at once. For a while, he became her anchor. She trusted him with secrets she had never spoken aloud. She thought she had found someone who would stand beside her through the storm. But storms reveal truths. His tenderness turned to control. His concern became demands. He watched her more closely than love required. Then, without warning, the money she had saved from years of sacrifice began to vanish. She discovered the withdrawals too late, and when she confronted him, the mask came off. He laughed at her disbelief. He told her he had never cared, that all he wanted was what she had left. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical, like a blade pressed to her chest. By then, she was already carrying Emma. Alone, penniless, and heavy with life inside her, Sarah tried to fight back against the current. She applied for jobs that would not call her back. She knocked on doors that closed in her face. The city she once believed held opportunity now looked at her with contempt. People's eyes slid past her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she deserved her downfall. Yet, through all of it, she kept moving. Nights were spent on hard benches, mornings in shelters, if there was space. She learned to hide her fear behind a quiet smile, so her daughter would never see how close she was to breaking. Emma's tiny fingers around hers gave her a reason to breathe when everything else told her to stop. The world offered cruelty, but her child offered hope. That was enough to keep her standing. Lying there in Daniel's mansion, Sarah let her tears fall silently. She traced Emma's cheek with her thumb, whispering promises the child was too young to understand. Tonight was not a palace, it was a borrowed corner of safety, but to her it felt like a miracle. For the first time in years, she did not have to look over her shoulder. For the first time, she believed she could close her eyes without fear. With Emma tucked against her, Sarah surrendered to rest, her heart torn between scars of the past and the fragile healing of this moment. Morning light crept through the tall windows, and Daniel found himself standing at the edge of the hallway, watching what felt like a scene from another life. Sarah was kneeling by the sofa, gently washing Emma with a damp cloth, her movements unhurried, almost tender, in a way Daniel had never seen up close. The little girl giggled at the touch, splashing water with her small hands, while her mother smiled with a softness that carried both weariness and devotion. Daniel felt a strange pull, as if time folded back on itself. He remembered his own childhood, the quiet rooms where no one came to soothe him, the long nights when his parents were too busy to notice he was even there. The memory pressed down hard, not in anger but in sorrow, a reminder of what he had long buried under ambition. Seeing Sarah with her child showed him what he had missed, and for the first time he admitted to himself how deep that emptiness had been. Emma looked up, her eyes bright despite her illness, and noticed Daniel in the doorway. She pointed a tiny finger at him and let out a cheerful sound, calling him uncle with the innocence only a child could carry. The word hit him harder than any accusation, because it was not born from fear or obligation. It was born from trust, from the simple way children see kindness, even in the smallest gestures. Something inside Daniel softened in that instant. His chest tightened, not with the usual weight of duty, but with an unfamiliar warmth. He had not earned such a title, yet hearing it made him feel connected in a way he had forgotten was possible. He stood there longer than he meant to, silent, holding on to that fleeting moment, knowing it had already begun to change him. Victoria's arrival shattered the fragile calm that had just begun to grow inside the house. She entered with the confidence of someone who had always believed she belonged there, her voice echoing through the hallway as she called Daniel's name. When her eyes landed on Sarah holding Emma, the warmth in her face twisted into cold disdain. She looked at Sarah from head to toe, the judgment sharp and unspoken, before turning her gaze back to Daniel with a smirk that carried both jealousy and triumph. Her words cut quickly. She said it was dangerous to let strangers inside, that women like Sarah knew how to use a child as a shield, that Daniel was blind to the possibility of being exploited. Each sentence dripped with suspicion, planting seeds that Daniel tried not to water, but could not fully ignore. He had spent his life guarding his empire against deception, and her voice tugged at old instincts. His chest tightened with the memory of betrayals he had buried long ago. Sarah stood frozen, her arms tightening around Emma, her face pale, but her dignity intact. Daniel turned toward her, his expression clouded, and asked in a low voice if there was more to her story than she had told him. The words were not cruel, but they carried doubt, and that was enough. Sarah's lips trembled, and for the first time since she stepped inside his mansion, she looked defeated. She whispered that she never wanted to take anything that was not hers. She only wanted her daughter to survive. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held her chin high, refusing to beg. Then she said the words that pierced the air like glass breaking. "We do not want to live by using anyone." With that, she gathered her child and turned away. Daniel did not move, torn between his mind and his heart. Victoria watched with satisfaction, convinced she had restored her place in his world. Yet as Sarah's footsteps faded, an ache spread inside him. He had seen truth in her eyes, even as his doubt pushed her away. For the first time in years, he felt not power but the hollow weight of losing, something he did not yet understand he needed. The silence, after their departure, was heavier than any storm Daniel had ever known. The mansion, once filled with a child's laughter and a woman's soft voice, returned to its old emptiness. Yet now the emptiness was unbearable, as if every echo of his footsteps reminded him of what he had driven away. He walked through the rooms, but saw only their shadows, the small moments that had slipped through his hands. At night, he sat alone in the living room where Sarah had once fed her daughter. He could almost hear Emma's giggles, smell the faint trace of food that had meant more than any feast. His chest tightened with regret, the kind that gnaws slowly and does not let go. He realized he had believed the wrong voice, and in doing so, he had wounded the only people who had given his house life. Unable to silence the torment, Daniel hired someone to learn the truth about Sarah. The report came back quickly, and each page was a wound deeper than the last. He read about her parents' death, her struggle through school, the man who deceived her, and the years she spent protecting her child against a world that turned cold. There was no trace of manipulation, only resilience, only sacrifice. Only a woman doing everything to survive with dignity. When he set the papers down, his hands were trembling. The weight of his mistake crushed him, heavier than any business loss he had endured. He saw again her eyes filled with pain when he questioned her, and her words about not wanting to use anyone. They cut deeper now because he knew she had spoken nothing but truth. He had doubted her, and in that doubt, he had lost something precious. For the first time in years, Daniel admitted he was afraid, not of failure or ruin, but of living out the rest of his life in this hollow house, knowing he had turned away the very light he needed. The loneliness pressed closer, sharper than before, and he knew he could not stay the same man. He had to change, or the emptiness would consume him. Daniel hesitated outside the worn wooden door, his hand clenched before he finally knocked. When it opened, Sarah stood there, her face cautious, her eyes carrying both fatigue and pride. The small room behind her smelled faintly of damp clothes and cheap soap, a world so far from his own wealth, yet more human than anything he had known. He spoke first, his voice low and stripped of the armor he had always worn. He admitted he had been wrong, that he had let doubt poison what little trust she had given him. He told her the truth he had avoided for years, that he was alone, and that her presence with Emma had shown him what family truly meant. His words trembled at the edges, not rehearsed, but pulled raw from the deepest part of him. Sarah's lips parted, but no answer came. She looked at him as if searching for insincerity, But what she saw instead was the face of a man who had finally lowered his guard. The silence stretched until Emma broke it. The little girl ran forward, her tiny arms wrapping around Daniel's legs, her voice innocent as she asked if he was coming back with them. The question pierced through the distance that Sarah had tried to keep. Daniel bent down, his arms gently circling the child, his face pressed against her hair as if afraid she might slip away. His eyes lifted towards Sarah, and in them she saw no calculation, only a man stripped bare by regret and longing. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally being believed. Her heart softened against her will, as if Emma's innocence had spoken louder than words ever could. She whispered that she had been afraid of being judged forever, yet in this moment she felt something shift. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to hope again. Sarah sat in silence, the weight of Daniel's words still pressing against her chest. She looked at Emma curled in his arms, her tiny face resting with complete trust, and something inside her began to loosen. Finally, she said she would return, but only if everything between them was built on honesty and trust, because she could not survive another betrayal. Daniel's eyes glistened as he nodded, his voice steady with conviction. He promised not just to provide shelter, but to protect them as his own family, to stand with them in every storm, instead of watching from afar. It was not wealth he offered, but a place in his life where they belonged. For the first time, Sarah believed his promise carried the weight of truth. When they walked back into the mansion, the silence that once ruled felt broken. Emma's laughter filled the grand rooms as she ran barefoot across the marble floor, her joy echoing higher than any chandelier. Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with relief as Daniel followed close behind, his gaze no longer cold but softened by love. The house, once a symbol of distance, had finally begun to feel like home. The moment that sealed everything came quietly. Emma tugged at Daniel's sleeve, her voice sweet as she called him Dad for the first time. Daniel froze, his throat tightening as if the word had carved a place deep in him that had long been empty. He knelt down, pulling her close, and in that instant the walls of his solitude fell away. Sarah's tears spilled freely, not from sorrow, but from the beauty of seeing her daughter find the father she had always deserved. Daniel sat in the garden with Sarah and Emma beside him, the soft warmth of morning light wrapping around them like a quiet blessing. Emma leaned against his arm, her small laughter blending with the rustle of leaves, while Sarah watched with a calm smile that held both relief and wonder. For the first time, the mansion grounds no longer felt like stone and silence, but like the heart of a family learning how to beat together. Sarah rested her hand over Daniel's, and he did not pull away. He let the weight of that gesture settle deep inside him, a reminder that trust was fragile, but worth protecting. He looked at her and saw not the desperation of a woman on the streets, but the strength of someone who had endured and still carried grace. Emma pointed toward the sky, her voice filled with delight at something only a child would notice, and Daniel realized how far he had come. He had been a man who lived behind walls of wealth and fear, yet a single act of kindness had led him here. One choice to open a door had rewritten the path of 3 lives. As the sun rose higher, the moment stretched, simple yet powerful. It was not the absence of pain that made it beautiful, but the way love had chosen to grow in the cracks. And in that silence, a truth became clear. Even when the past is marked by loss, compassion can mend what was broken. Sometimes one small act of kindness is enough to change an entire future. From the night Daniel found a mother and her child trembling in the dark, to the moment his cold mansion became a home filled with laughter, their journey was one of pain, turning into hope. It showed that even the hardest heart can be softened by love, and even the deepest loneliness can be healed by compassion. This is more than a story about one man, one woman, and one child. It is a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can change a life forever. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Emotional Echoes, so together we can keep spreading stories that heal and inspire. Thanks for listening.